Hello and welcome to the Future of Transportation Management webinar hosted by FourPL and JDA. My name is Chelsea Easton and I'm the Marketing Manager at FourPL. Before I introduce you to our speakers today, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the partnership between JDA and FourPL. FourPL is an Australian IT advisory company specialising in supply chain, and we have a strong track record in the logistics industry in Australia. JDA software provides integrated supply chain solutions to 4,000 of the largest retail, manufacturing, logistics companies and distributors across the globe. JDA's software solution provides a valuable addition to FourPL's transport systems capability, and FourPL's logistics advisory expertise gives the JDA team a unique insight to the logistics industry in Australia. 2016 is the first year of our partnership and we're looking forward to building our teams together. Our first presenter today is Brasco, Vice President Solutions Strategy at JDA, and Fabrizio is one of the authors of the white paper we'll be discussing today. Our second presenter today is Anthony Hawkins, CEO of FourPL. Fab and Anthony will discuss the trends that we're seeing here in Australia and how technology is evolving to assist professionals with the challenges of tomorrow. I'll now hand you over to Fabrizio to take you through the white paper.
Thank you, Chelsea. So the intent of the white paper was to take a look at the major market trends that we're seeing emerge today and think about how that affects the world of transportation, both today and really further into the future, where transportation really needs to go. And really the paper focuses on 5 major core trends that have emerged. So the first is this whole advent of the consumer-centric supply chain. And I really refer to it in terms of consumer centricity, so the whole power of the consumer to buy anywhere and any time, rather than omni-channel, because really omni-channel is a consequence. It's really about the consumer behavior and the consumer buying power that's really driving the change in transportation. Then we talk about this notion of supply chain unification. So really as a consequence of the way supply chains are changing, we talk about the need for upstream planning and downstream execution to really converge into the need to break down those silos. We then talk about the increasing need to utilize capacity in any form. And really what we're talking about there is, today, transportation solutions in general, focus on the notion of consolidation and routing, but there's a lot of waste. There's a lot of space that still exists in the way transportation solutions work. So we're seeing this trend for companies to take more advanced views on how they think about transportation to really capitalize on that wasted space. Then we talk about the whole world of what we term interactive simplicity. So think about how you interact with your smartphone and the fact that you've never really had to have any training to use it, and yet it's the center of many of our lives. How does that going to affect the world of technology, how users interact with solutions, and how that's going to enable them to make better decisions? And then lastly, and in general, we talk about the digitization of transportation. So how much is transportation from a solution perspective going to take over and evolve in terms of eliminating paper, increase the ease of onboarding for carriers? How is it going to evolve in those more advanced ways to make the whole network interact much more fluidly?
Fab, it's a great paper. Firstly, I'd just like to thank you and you personally and JDA for putting together such a great piece of thought leadership around the transportation industry. It's a really great read, and I think it's one of these papers that is addressing the issues that are going to keep people awake at night. We all know that transportation is such a critical part of the supply chain, and if anything goes wrong in the supply chain, if there's any constraints or deficiencies within the supply chain, we just know that things shut down, and we're all existing on such thin margins these days, so any event or any constraint is just, our profitability is just going to evaporate. So for me personally, the paper, we're going to be able to take some of these concepts and build them into our strategy engagements as we're helping our customers select their systems. But I'd like to drill deeper down on a couple of areas of the paper. The main areas I'd like to go into is around this interaction simplicity, a little bit more on the digitisation of the supply chain, and this supply chain unification concept. On that first point, this interaction simplicity, so You know, we can all relate to the technology now. We have these mobile phones and all of these applications, and they're really, really easy to use. You don't have to think too much when you're using them. You don't have to be taught how to use these applications. You essentially can pick up the phone and just start going for it. You know, we're all dealing with this issue now with a change in our workforce with these new people. They're coming in and that's all they've been used to. They've been just used to using these sorts of devices. And we throw them in front of these really great, big, complex screens, and they have to deal with it. So, you know, sort of how are we specifically addressing this? How are we going to deal with these really great, big, complex screens and all this detailed information when people are just being used to just picking up something and running with it? Can you paint a picture for us on this, Fabio?
Yeah, these are great questions, and I really like to look at this world of interactivity in a couple of ways, if you will. So the first is, from a usability perspective, I mean, solutions today are moving to mobile interaction. More and more, there's this move to moving away from the desktop and enabling, you know, mobile or tablet-enabled devices, particularly for, you know, for those that are outside the office, so carriers, you know, suppliers, those that have to interact from outside a core system. So I think it's moving in that direction today, and they're, you know, by design, they're intended to be pretty intuitive and not really need a lot of training, much like our other mobile apps that we interact with today. But there's a couple of other perspectives that I think we also need to think about. For those that still need to do that kind of control tower type planning, one of the ways that we think that the solutions really need to move into, or one of the areas it needs to move into, is really becoming more, and I like to use kind of, you know, let's say you use Facebook as an example. You know, Facebook doesn't have less information, it has more. But what they've done is they've provided a greater ability for the user to tune it in such a way that they get the information they want in the way they can digest it. So user interfaces are really being geared towards that, where you still want to expose a good amount of data in order to make better decisions, but you want to do it in a way that where the users can tune it to stream to them in a way that they can digest. And then the last kind of area is, I've always been a proponent that, you know, one way to look at usability is by counting mouse clicks, right? Or even, you know, touches of the screen, right? The fewer the better. But what if you didn't have to touch it at all, right? In my mind, that's the highest form of usability. So one of the areas that we're looking into is, when you think about the areas of visibility and real-time analytics, predictive analytics, is can we make the views more proactively intelligent? Can we make views for the transportation user, say the planner, in such a way where they're presenting information that's contextual, as things happen and things need to be resolved, they're bringing the right information to the user that they need to make those decisions, and maybe in some cases, maybe proactively making decisions for them. So we really think that is the next generation of real usability.
Thanks, Fab. So you also mentioned digitization. So we're all dealing with this. You go and look in the front of a truck these days and they just have reams of paper. They've got folders, they've got hazardous goods information, they've got their run sheet, they've got their driver logbook, they've got all of this paper in the cab. But surely we can't continue to do this. We're just dealing with, or drowning in this paper. We're seeing changes in our industry here as well, where some of the regulators are now actually allowing us to actually remove some of that paper. But it's still difficult to see how it's all going to come together. So with this removal of paper and trying to get all of this paper and the inefficiency of that paper out of the cab, how do you see that moving? Have you seen this happening in other countries?
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of area of commentary here. And here's a case where, the intent of the paper was to think, in the future from a technology perspective. But on this particular topic, quite honestly, technology is not the limitation. The technology exists today. When you think about, scanning ability from a mobile phone, the ability to capture documents, to store documents, all the the electronic footprint and breadcrumbs that solutions can capture. I mean, right down to capturing live GPS. All of those things exist today. But what needs to happen is there needs to be some sort of intervening body to force organizations to use that in a more real way. And you mentioned, regulatory requirements, right? What we have seen is without that government mandate to legislate more, green or sustainable practices to push towards the removal of paper, there's a reluctance or a limitation in terms of how much organizations adopt that type of technology. And I love to use my own experience from my background in transportation software. Prior to Sarbanes-Oxley, which was the financial legislation in North America, if I ever talked to a customer about something like freight auditing, it would take about 5 minutes. But as soon as that legislation was passed, well, then the conversations got deeper and longer. And so, we have seen that in places like Europe where they have more significant legislation on green initiatives. So you see different and better utilizations of trucks. You see a lot more removal of paper from the process, but that needs to have much more global adoption.
So the third point that I read in the paper, and you mentioned it earlier on, was around this point of supply chain unification. Now, this last one, it's a really hot topic, but I'm not really sure if a lot of people really understand this topic as well. We know things are changing. We know that consumers are just expecting goods to arrive and for you to deliver them to them regardless of how they order them, whether they click on a web or walk into the store or ring up or whatever way or whatever channel that they use. And we know that our supply chains are becoming more complex. A lot more nodes. It's a network of nodes as opposed to these nice linear supply chains. Yeah, we're being pushed down this channel by our customers. We're being forced into this, but it's really hard to deal with this concept. And this, people talk about omnichannel. They talk about supply chain unification. Yeah, how are people dealing with this? How are they using software? How are they dealing with this issue?
Yeah, it's a great question, and again, let me come at it from a couple of angles. So, first is, and you said the right word. It's an area where there requires quite a bit of education, and that's not unusual, particularly when you're thinking about technology and advances in technology. I think back, when I started this space 20 years ago, I used to talk to retailers and manufacturers about leveraging their outbound trucks, their outbound assets to do inbound pickup, right? Doing backhauls and continuous moves. And in a lot of cases, I would run into organizational resistance that was considered witchcraft. And yet today that's a common practice because organizations, leading organizations understood the value, they took it on, they broke down their own organizational silos to make that happen. And really this convergence of supply chain planning and execution really needs to go through that same metamorphosis. We do have the industry trend of this consumer centricity, omni-channel really forcing the change. And I really like to use the analogy of an old garden hose where you can have an old garden hose in your backyard, and if you trickle the water through, it looks fine. Well, those are supply chains as they existed today or 5 years ago before all this change. But as soon as you turn the water on full blast, you start to see the weaknesses, you see the leaks spring. And that's what organizations are faced with today, in that as now they're faced with this stress on their supply chains, they're seeing the leaks, they're seeing the flaws. And so what we think really needs to happen is, the cause of a lot of those flaws is that there's a disconnect between the way organizations plan, particularly to how they plan to replenish inventory into their networks and position inventory into their networks. And there's a disconnect between that planning process and the realities and constraints that happen in execution, whether it be space at the DC or the availability of trucks. And so what we think needs to happen when you converge the two worlds is there's got to be an exposure and interaction of those potential bottlenecks upstream to that planning process. And then planning solutions have to understand what to deal with that, how to deal with that level of granularity. If you can get those two worlds working seamlessly, then that helps remove those bottlenecks and creates that fluidity that will allow organizations to have much more responsive and proactively reactive supply chains to be able to deal with these stresses.
That's sort of great answer, great response. It's I'll just repeat again. Sort of like the white paper that you've put together and JDA have put together is really quite insightful. It gives us a really good view of some of these issues that we're going to need to deal with in the next few years. And hopefully, as people, I encourage people to actually read the paper in detail. You'll get a much better understanding of what you need to do to start to address these issues and what sort of capabilities you need to put in place to actually solve these. But mate, just want to thank you again. The fantastic insight, and I really appreciate your time on this.
Thank you, Anthony and Fab, for your insights and comments about the future of transportation management over the next decade and beyond. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon.